I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
What we know from history is that it was a profoundly different experience in many regards than the experience you and I have today.
Are you ready for the question?
But that I Have a Dream speech really changed America, and it gave people hope that this really can happen.
After that speech, life wasn't the same anymore.
Freedom! Freedom! Freedom now! Somebody's asking, how long will prejudice blind the visions of men?
The marches, the demonstrations, the protests, all of the things that were taking place were fascinating. It was a good time to be alive. We hardly wanted to go to bed at night.
The means by which we live have outdistanced the spiritual ends for which we live. And so we find ourselves caught in a messed up world.
You ought to have some great faith that grips you so much, you will never give it up. Somehow you go on and say, I know that the God that I worship is able to deliver me.
This system of segregation tends to set up false standards, and it scars the personality of the individuals of both races.
To rob a man of his freedom is to take the essential basis of his manhood.
He was one of the greatest nonviolent leaders we've ever had in the history of the world. He inspired people.
This young preacher skyrocketed to his dreams and hopes that cared about people, that loved God.
Because of his efforts, this world is a better place in which to live, and I want to thank him for a job well done in helping others to realize their dreams.
I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
Welcome everyone to Revisiting the Dream. I'm your host, Pastor Gordon Fraser, and with me I have an impressive guest of panelists. We're going to be discussing different topics today. We just want to welcome you. I want to welcome Pastor Paul Lowe with us today, and I also welcome Dr. Casey Adams, who is also with us today, and Pastor Mays, who is with us today. We're going to have a great discussion. Gentlemen, welcome to this opportunity to share and to discuss revisiting the dream, this dream that was rooted in American history and American culture. Now, as we look at the unrest that is taking place today, the civil unrest that's going on today, it went on in Dr. King's day. What do we need to do as a nation to adjust towards the freedoms that Dr. King envisioned for us? What are some of the things that we need to do? What do you think, gentlemen? What do we need to do?
I think one of the things that we're missing that we've had in those days is a united voice. There is so much division, even amongst those that you would think are united. And I don't mean just political groups. I think with even ethnic groups, culturally, there's such a great divide. And because there's not a united voice, there's not a one direction that everybody's trying to move to. I think that causes even more confusion, and it's causing more unrest.
Blessed to be. We don't need another political uprising. We need one voice. Pastor Lowe, what were you sharing?
Blessed to be here. I want to echo the sentiments of what my brother Dr. Casey was just saying. And I think if we are contrasting the 60s civil rights movement in terms of the momentum, there are a few things that we need to ensure we not repeat. So I would start with ensuring that we have focus, and that is that our objectives and our definition of success is clear. What exactly are we hoping to embrace as a goal? There's a lot that was good within the civil rights movement, but I think we also, that is of the 60s, but I think we also got caught off guard in a few things. So for example, we were steadfast in our commitment towards equality, right? In so many various ways across the platform. Uh, Integration, however, seemed to become the greater goal or the greater objective. And we tended to, we somewhat lost the economic value within the civil rights struggle. So there was a value of integration, but there was also a value of economic prosperity that we were trying to accomplish, and it got lost. I'm just going to say it like that. It got lost because we still ended up having this predicament of being packed into ghettos and urban communities that were impoverished and marginalized, et cetera. We still didn't do so well in attaining economic enterprise. So as we go forth with this continuing civil rights struggle, if we're using Washington as a platform somewhat, I think as we go forth, we need to have our goals clearly defined. How do we define success in terms of the goals that we are addressing? I love what my brother also said as far as the unity. What we need to ensure we bring into this continuing struggle or we reclaim is what I call our Pan-African value, right? There was a strong sense of Pan-Africanism pre and during the civil rights movement that it somehow it was good through the 70s also, and then it started to just die, wherein we're now an integrated yet segregated body of people of color. And listen, our current generation, right, our children, they're picking up on it very well. We need to catch up. So this Pan-Africanism is something I'm seeing within our civil culture. I'm not seeing it so well within the church. So I think within the religious culture that we have here, we need to tap on that.
Pastor Mace, do you have anything that you want to add to this conversation right now as to how do we adjust and how do we move forward with this dream that Dr. King had laid out?
Yes, and we all kind of hinted towards the specific point. And to quote Dr. King, prejudice blinds the eyes of men and women. So in order for us to be able to interact or maybe integrate with one another, I think we all have to learn from each other in a unique way. And that is starting with telling the truth about what happened historically and addressing the trauma. Because if we're trying to go from more of a action and what we're going to do going forward, we all know as pastors, true forgiveness can only start once you address the hurt and the issue at hand. And you have to do it in a way where both parties understand that truthfully and that with the utmost integrity, that what we have learned about one another can change the perception of how we view one another and try to denigrate some of these prejudices that are often practiced in our cultural circles. And I think if we do that, then what Martin Luther King is really stating about the prejudiceness that blinds individual will now take the eye salve, or we say in Revelation, that eye salve, that eye ointment, and be able to allow someone to see. In order for someone to see, however, we have to be in a moral, have a moral compass that judges both our actions and both of what we send out to the perception of those who hold these prejudice and bias. And the only way we can do that is through the healing and through the teachings of Jesus Christ, which mentions that even though we as some people, some feel, especially being a person of color, with how we are treated differently than others, to bring us to the case in point of what happened on Capitol Hill, and then what happened in Kenosha, and what happened in areas in which I participate in peaceful marches in Chicago. We were, and just to make this hit home, the practical method and the practical situation, I realized too, it was young people that I saw out there marching in the majority than the elder generation. Not to attack one generation, but that's just a fact. They were there. And what I realized is when the young people united, it became more problematic for the government institution to meet that or combat that gathering and that unity with violent measures, meaning there were snipers on the rooftop, heavy policing. The policing will come up and ask you questions. And I would say that's a level of harassment, and then not see the same treatment on someone who on a group of individuals who attacked our government and the staple of our strength in government. And I think it was a message of not just the attack of the government, but it was more so an attack on the ideal of the basis of what America was founded, and that's on God's principle and God's law.
You guys talked about that. You talked about unity, and we're looking at attack on the government just a few days ago. Can we move forward? Can we unify after all that has taken place? I know we talk about forgiving or being able to look at the past before we can move forward to the future. But with all of that, do you think we can move forward? And how can we move forward? What are some of the steps we can take to move forward?
Right now,
Go ahead, bro.
and I'll be honest with you, and all of you watching, can we move forward right now? No. No, we can't move forward because there has been, for decades, centuries, issues that have not been addressed. And I don't just mean for Black people, I mean period. Everybody's saying all of a sudden these people are coming out of the woodworks. No, this has been festering and bubbling up under the skins of people, this kind of hatred, this kind of insurrection behavior. This is not something new. This is something that has to be addressed from its core before we could ever move forward. And some say, well, it's just an isolated incident. We need to just get up and move forward. You can't move forward until there's justice. Point blank, period. There has to be a form of justice. And some would argue that the only justice that we can receive is from God. Agreed. However, there is work that we can do. There is work that has to be done. Reconciliation from those who have, we need to sit down. I think that's another thing that's missing. We need to sit down. We need to have an open and honest dialogue with those who we love and those who we do not agree with. I think there needs to be a conversation and talked about, because I think ignorance on all sides has caused us to divide and not be able to come together and talk.
Yeah. Go ahead, Doctor. Go ahead, Pastor.
Oh, thank you, man. Listen, I'm going to try it this way. What do we do next, right? So what's our next move? And this may not sit with most of us here, but I'm going to say we need to get out the way. All right, that's my short answer response. Where do we go from here? We need to get out the way. Much of this is necessary, but is not our immediate fight, right? So let the parties for whom it is a fight, let them deal with their fight. Let them go forth with whatever objectives they have, with whatever needs or values they are trying to reinforce, whether it be nationalism, whether it be patriotism, the various vigilantism, militia, all these very terms that I'm hearing here, whatever the values are to the majority, then let them go ahead with it. I honestly don't see how we contributing to the force that encamped on the White House, or us trying to jump in to protect the White House, so to speak, right? If we were to stand in between that group and there's no great benefit for us in that sense, right? So get out of the way. That's my first counsel. Now, once we get out of the way and we stand back, let me join with Dr. Casey here. There are things that we need to do constructively to prepare ourselves for what is coming next. Now, the next flag that I'm going to wave as a caution and as a warning to our people is to be very careful of partisanship. I see a lot of momentum wherein, the Republican momentum versus the Democratic momentum, the Trump momentum versus the Biden momentum, so to speak. Listen, no, I honestly don't feel there is a partisan choice or conduit that could bring us the goals or the victory or the liberation that we truly need. So we need to stay on our knees in prayer, definitely, be prayerful. We need to ensure that we amongst ourselves, as well as how we interact with our family and friends and peer who may be part of that struggle, that we are not, we're neither complacent nor are we combative, right? So let's remain prayerful as we get into the spiritual of how we should deal with all of this. And there certainly is a spiritual, moral motto that we need to follow.
If we're, let's be honest in this conversation here, based on what happened in the Capitol, everyone is, there's a lot of people that's blaming the current president. And some people are not blaming him for what took place. If we're to truly move forward, do you think blame is going to help? Do you think that is going to contribute to us moving forward, united?
I wouldn't say blame. I would say accountability.
Accountability. Okay.
Accountability. Because here's the thing: if we just let it slide, we let these then what's going to happen is people are going to feel empowered. People are going to feel like, well, if I want something done, this is the way to go about it. And big things can turn into bigger things. And that's one of the reasons. And unfortunately, state governments have gotten a clear understanding about what has happened at the U.S. Capitol, because come the inauguration day, all state capitals are surrounded by armed guards from whatever agencies each state has gotten, and they've realized that what was done there at the Capitol can be done anywhere. And there's, it's more than civil unrest against just the United States, and that was a demonstration. It's civil unrest across the nation, and they don't know what's coming next. And so accountability is so key to holding someone. And I don't think, we're off in holding certain people accountable, because it's not just they said one thing one day and all of a sudden people just uprose. It has been time after time after time. The media has been allowing it to spew. It's been said, it's all over social media. And over time, people's minds have been corrupted into thinking that this is the way that it should be done. And basically, the day that it happened, it was just somebody pulled the trigger. All that time was development of the gun and the bullet. And that day was pulling of the trigger. And I think accountability is so key in moving forward.
Yes, can I make a comment onto that as well?
Go ahead.
And I want to reference two books. One is Jesus of the Disinherited. And one thing he mentioned about the first step to kind of transitioning from the hurts and ills and the trauma of being treated as the inferior in a capitalistic society we call America, is first thing we need to do is uproot of bitterness and betrayal. But I would even go further than that, than using the word uproot, maybe the word uproar. We need to cause an uproar about the bitterness and betrayal that happens on a day-to-day basis. And it's not just historical. One thing I really liked about history, and it may sound negative, but history can be subjective based upon who's writing the history. One thing that cannot lie is time. Time is objective, excuse me. So what we're looking at right now while we're talking about MLK is that his dream of uniting and his dream of seeing in a world in which people can be judged not based upon what they look like, but what is inside the individual, became a present nightmare because we are still struggling with what we were going through in history. And the truth be told, history would tell you an unparalleled amount of change has happened. But time has showed you that his dream is still a dream. It's not our present reality. And the only way we could figure that out is through time. And so I would also say now, while we're on the word time, let's use this as the time to uproar against the bitterness and the betrayal that we have faced in this nation. And then we can go into the other methods where Dr. Casey mentioned that we can go into the sit down portion. But until we have a basis, a rule of thumb to have a discussion, it would just be conjuncture, your side versus my side, until we can judge it based upon the evidence of time.
And can I add to that real quick? Just
go ahead.
Two little things, and I so agree. And that basis really has to be the basis of love. Dr. King talked about his dream a lot, but one of the things he also talked about a lot of time and was his motivating factor was love. Two quotes I want to share with you that he said specifically on this. The first was, "He who is devoid of the power to forgive is devoid of the power to love." And the other one is, "Love is the only force capable of transforming an enemy into a friend." And so how we can move forward and address a lot of the issues that we're facing is come with a spirit of love, even though we have been hurt, even though our community for decades have been hurt, even though we've made progress, we still have to operate out of a spirit of love.
I agree with you, Dr. Casey. And to, belabor your point, let's not forget about Matthew, the 22 chapter and 37 and 39, where where he says the first commandment is love thy God with all their heart and their soul and their might. And then he turns around and says, but what is greater than the first is the one of the second, which is love thy neighbor as thyself. And so what he was really, but this is what I wanted to kind of bring out the point. He brought out this point amongst civil unrest, not only in the religious spectrum, but also the political spectrum. And when we talk about Rome, and yet, in fact, amongst that oppression, he still labored the point that Dr. Casey brought out, is to love thy neighbor. And so I think that is essential. However, I think that even with the loving of thy neighbor, we realized that this was deeper than just that love of just an individual. The spiritual component was to love thy God first. And what my point is that as a nation, it's hard to start out a premise or a conversation with an individual that you haven't manifested godly love first. So I think what happens is what MLK showed us is once you had the godly love, the love of God, the love of that stimulated his love for humanity, which allowed him to be able to adjust to the obstacles of hatred and to continue to preach the message and to live the message of love for thy neighbor.
And what I'm hearing you saying is that we need to have some kind of love for each other before we can really sit down. So it's obviously that somehow we don't have the love in order to sit down, because over the years, over time, since Dr. King, since his dream, we're as a people, as African-American people, we are still dealing with racial tensions. We are still dealing with some of the very basic things that he was trying to push against. And so have you seen any change over time from Dr. Martin Luther King's time? Have we made any progress in changing the narrative?
Yes. And I want to get back to the spiritual definitions that I heard being resonating here. Let's talk about that change. This is what I would say. There has been progress. I would even say there's been great progress. There's been less change. Why I say that? I say that because the factors that establish, or the factors that led to our need for a civil rights struggle, so to speak, they're still here. We were so eloquently reminded of such by the contribution of one of our senators on Capitol Hill there, Senator Cruz. When he started to appeal to the Senate, he referenced the 1877 election. And I think it went over the head of a lot of folk, because most of us historically don't know what happened in 1877. But the fact that he would call that into reference in 1877, now his point was this, look, we need to settle this election, taking a closer look at the popular vote and the electoral vote, because the electoral college issue is being challenged and all of that. That's what happened in 1877 also between Hayes and Tilden, if I'm remembering the two candidates correctly. Hayes, who won the electoral vote, was the Republican and was the one who supported, or who had a greater support for, the liberation, emancipation, and civil rights of African Americans, federal troops to protect during the Reconstructive period. African Americans would be allowed to vote. African Americans would be allowed to own business, own land, et cetera, et cetera. What Reconstruction purposed to do would have been the starting of the civil rights movement way back then. But the agreement they made was this. They said, look, since we have all this tension over the electoral college and the popular vote, and you won by the electoral college, we will recognize that and we will accept that as a win if you stop with all of this stuff about protecting African Americans with federal troops, allowing them to vote, allowing them to own business, allowing them to own property. We don't want none of that. And the agreement was made. And so in exchange for Hayes becoming president, Reconstruction was thrown out the window. And what we got instead of Reconstruction was Jim Crow. No federal protection for African Americans in the South. No entitlement or economic support towards owning business, starting business, no incentives provided, no right to vote, et cetera, et cetera. So the civil rights movement would have started from 1877. And can you imagine, if we have made progress, if you would agree with me that there has been progress, if we have made progress in 50 something years, imagine the progress we would have attained if the civil rights movement had begun in 1877. So the resentment and the resistance and such that caused the rejection of Reconstruction, they're still here. they just the same way they were still evident in 1960s when the civil rights movement finally was given momentum or allowance. They were there. They're still here today. So yes, there has been progress, but there's been less change. as it pertains to the opposing factors, right? And let me get real about that. I'm trying to find a safe way to term these things so I don't offend. So what I'm saying is legislative changes have been made, right? But the values of supremacy and the values of privilege continue for one side over the other.
Say it like you mean it, Pastor Lowe. The heart of man has not changed.
Yes.
The
Yes.
heart of man has not changed. And to your point, I agree. What I will say is there's a lot of knowledge now, but little wisdom.
Mm.
There's a lot of knowledge. People know. I watched a video the other day, Court TV, Court Cam, and there was a case where these two people were on trial. They were actually being sentenced because they pointed a loaded shotgun at a group. They were people who were supporting the Confederate flag, and they were driving by this birthday party. It was on all over the news, and they had pointed a loaded shotgun at the party goers, and of course they broke Georgia state law, and they were being sentenced. And when they were there giving their telling the judge how sorry they were, one of the things that struck me, she said, we knew it was wrong, but we, we're not that kind of people.
Mm.
Your heart will do what your heart has been conditioned to do.
Mm-hmm.
That's why there's no progress. We're not moving forward. As Pastor stated, there's legislative changes, there are changes on the record, but the heart of man has yet to change. And the reason why we have not changed is because, of course, there is no love. And another quote I found from Dr. King says, I have decided to stick with love because hate is too great a burden to bear. And what I glean from that is you can't bear up both. It's one or the other. You can't say there's love in your heart, but there's hate against a specific set of subgroup of people, or you're hating someone because they have something that you should have, or vice versa. There is no love.
Mm.
And the last thing I'll say on that is another quote from Dr. King. Says, man must evolve for all human conflict a method which rejects revenge, aggression, and retaliation. The foundation of such a method is love. If there is no change in our hearts moving forward, being a people who plan and have a clear focus, we will continue to see years pass and no changes being made.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I agree what he said, Pastor Gordon. And I also, to answer the question of progress, I cannot in my hearts of hearts say that we haven't made any progress, but I have to shed light on the negative progress we made. In the 1940s, we had the Jim Crow. Now we have negatively progressed into mass incarceration. And one of the books, Jim Crow by a New Name, mentioned that the Jim Crow was bad, but we got far more worse at a large scale of stigmatizing and marginalizing people of color with the unfair treatment of the legal system, which allows them to be into new chains in the penal system. And so, yes, we've made progress, but I think the progress that we're looking to make, and to be fair, is the progress of ideals. See, Obama was an ideal that Black people can become a man who can lead a country with not only elegance, but with class. See, Kamala Harris is an ideal that interracial woman can be the second in command. See, Martin Luther King stood for an ideal that, a pastor and a preacher that can stimulate reform with the basis and foundation of God's necessary principle, elegantly preached from Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5. And see, we have to become ideals. And what becoming an ideal is, we have to demand the unfair treatment of how we betrayed, not only in media, but also how we allow ourselves to be betrayed once we enter these social circles. And this book, which is called Brainwashing, brought me to the point that it's a marketing strategy by those who feel as if they're superior than one race than the other, than to control the outlook of how society views them. If it, case in point, if you read your articles and you watch your television shows, you don't have to search in Google search if a Black person committed a crime. Their face is planted there with everyone to see. It seems the fact that when other people of non-African descent commit crime, you have to Google search. You have to almost do the FBI investigation to identify a perpetrator to be viewed. Case in point, I hate to be bringing up Capitol Hill, but the people viewed on Capitol Hill were viewed as patriots and people who were unfairly treated and marched Capitol Hill for change and justice. Yet, in fact, people who are just protesting the fact, and the Capitol Hill was about just losing an election and an attack of democracy. People of color have been protesting for the attack of their lives and the lives of their children, and be met with the moniker as being called thugs, criminals, Antifa, to name them. And the people on the other side who attack our Capitol Hill and democracy are called Proud Boys and people of justice. So I think that is where we have to do. We have to change the narrative with the control of how we're being marketed out to the world. And I think we need to demand more from our social sectors to change the narrative. So we have to be ideals first as individuals.
I think too, real quick, I think another reason why I can say that there has been a challenge with looking at how much progress we've made is because we have been very silent. It wasn't up until recently that we really started pushing the agenda of, listen, we're not where we're supposed to be and we need to get there. We've been real silent. The church has been real silent. Us as ministers have been silent. You talk about the comparisons between the 60s and now. There was a real force within the community led by the religious leaders saying, listen, there needs to be some social reform. And what happened is we got comfortable. Right around the 80s and 90s, you can see that we got a little quiet. And that's because we were comfortable. People moving to the suburbs, people happy, people have money's coming in. But as soon as the dynamics shift, we now we want to have a bullhorn. And then you have the other side of those that are looking at, well, why are they marching now? And they don't understand. And it's because it's partly due to our silence instead of keeping the agenda. And that's why I said there's an important element that has to be of a plan. You have to have a plan. We can preach about the dream. We can preach about where we're supposed to be at. But what I haven't heard preached a whole lot or taught or spoke about is what's the plan to get to where we're going to?
Yes, sir.
What is the united plan? Because everybody has their little, and that the other thing is back in the 60s, they moved as a group, as a unit trying to grow. But now we're in little silos. We're in our own little, and we're just trying to grow ourselves. Whereas if we got together and built as a community, we could grow a lot more. There would be a lot more progress.
Dr. Casey.
Yes, sir.
I wanted to kind of say something just so we could be fair to the statement.
Mm-hmm.
Let us not ignore history. Let us look at the FBI and their mission to the attack on the Black Messiah, which is not too far-fetched to what we read in the Bible, which entailed with the drowning of Moses because Satan's fear of a Messiah, the attack of Solomon because of the fear of the Messiah, and also the attack of Jesus because he said he was a Messiah. And if we understand that what's always going to be attacked historically, and the same reference in history was the attack on the Black Messiah, which is just the attack on the ideal of someone of color to come to a leadership position in which they unite change amongst a system that was already developed to oppress one individual above the other. But I wanted to mention to you the point that you said about that is, yes, we can we can make changes, and we can make progression in those changes. And it seems to me that it's easiest for us to say, being based upon the documents that we read, not only with biblically, but also with our society, that normally it invites the African Americans to who are considered the inferior to be the beginning of the initial process of asking for forgiveness. And I want to say that to people who are sick and tired of that, I want to encourage them that what you did mention, that it's hard to erase hate without love. And it's hard to even, sometimes it takes for the one who really doesn't need to ask for forgiveness to be the initiator to ask for forgiveness, not to free themselves, not to free the individual, but to free themselves. And so I think once we start there, we can get into the dialogue and get into true progression and true change.
So can we, as an African American people, can we maintain peace, or how do we maintain peace even though we're marginalized, even though people disagree with us, disagree with our views? Someone said that if it was a whole lot of African Americans that marched on the Capitol, then we would have been having a different narrative, would have been a different story, because the National Guard and DC Police and every armed forces, maybe even Air Force Ones, jets would have been flying over. How do we maintain peace as African American people in the midst of all that is going on?
Thank you. There doesn't need to. We don't need an if because it actually occurred. So we have the clear contrast of the BLM efforts and those who were protesting the death of George Floyd, etc., and how our nation responded to that, including how they responded to it in the area of the Capitol. That I don't even need to get into that because it's already documented evidence right there. But let me start on a quote from Dr. King, since we've been dropping a few this evening. I love, darkness cannot drive out darkness, right? That's what Dr. King said. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that, right? So I am an ardent supporter of being nonviolent. I'm an ardent supporter also of being unconditional in terms of how we begin and approach forgiveness. Now, let me go a little deep, right? For the sake of time. There is an excellent moral given to us in Genesis chapter 45 in the experience of Moses. Sorry, let me get that right. It's late. I'm sorry. It's been a long day. In the experience of Joseph. And when we look at that narrative and we see the historical of Joseph, forgiveness towards his brothers, man, there is a tremendous, amazing line of parallel between the experience of Joseph and his brothers and how he comes to this point of reconciliation and what we as people of color experience within our own bondage. All right, so let me just drop a few. I'm going to try to be as succinct as possible, and because the story goes real deep. Now, Joseph it was a group of 12 brothers, right? Group of 12 brothers. The 12 brothers would turn against one. We were a diverse group of brothers on the continent of Africa, right? And so there were many dominant tribes that would turn against the lessers. But, check this out. Joseph's brothers intended to kill him. But one of them, Judah, as you know, then suggested, let's not do that. That would not be right. Let's sell him into slavery. Well, for sure, within the pattern of the Ashantis, they had a lot of war captives. And the Ashantis actually saw it as a humanitarian exercise. Let's not keep killing those who we capture. Let's sell them into slavery, right? And so it was done. So one child was sold into slavery, and that would be the product of what we call the diaspora that would reach South America, the Caribbean, the Americas, and all. But look at this, just like Joseph, God would do something through that child that was displaced across the oceans to then grow to prominence and provide something in return to his brothers, albeit African Americans today. We today stand as, Africa's economic value or economic strength and power is far more outside the continent of Africa than it is in the continent of Africa today. Now, resource-wise, Africa, the continent, is still rich. I'm talking about the mindset, right? We, the African American product, we, the diaspora. Come on, man, all the basketball players, all the rappers, all the politicians, all the actors, the wealth that is comprised amongst the African American diaspora and what we have done for Africa. We are bringing change to Africa once again. Yes, but look at God. Now, I credit God with all of that because, listen, I can't find anything good to tell you about, that I can praise slavery for, but I can certainly praise God for what he has done in spite of. Now, back to Joseph. Look at how Joseph forgave his brothers. Read Genesis 45. I'm asking everybody to do it. I don't have time to go through the exegetical and all of that stuff, but let me begin by saying the first thing Joseph did was Joseph made sure this process of forgiveness was between himself and his brothers. He said, leave the room. All of you get out. You Egyptians, you Greeks, the whole of y'all, go, leave our presence. And he dealt with the issue with his brothers face to face between his brothers. So we have a reconciliation that we need to engage or continue to engage between us. You heard me say earlier, we lost our value of Pan-Africanism. That is that the civil rights movement, you had Harry Belafonte from Jamaica, you had Storky Carmichael from Trinidad, Louis Farrakhan himself is of Caribbean parentage, Marcus Garvey was Jamaican. I mean, I could go on and on and on, right? So this thing about African American being defined solely as those who were birthed here. Now, yes, I agree in definition, yes. But as it pertains to the struggle, listen, it has to be collective. It has to be collective. So all of us who are here, whether we're first generation or fifth generation, you face the same degree of oppression. Now, as it pertains to telling the story, the legacy of African American legacy, I shut up because I've only been here 43 years of my life. I share with you, I was born in Ghana, South America. I grew up in Brooklyn, but the legacy, I don't share the same legacy as my brother here, Pastor Mace, who has a mother, a grandmother, a great-grandmother, and a great-great-grandparent that were of this soil. So it's a different legacy, but it's the same struggle. We're sharing the same struggle. Forgiveness has to start from within. We have to forgive each other. There is still black on black issues, and I can talk more about that in the next question or comment. But we also need to understand that the work of forgiveness is a miraculous work. The work of forgiveness is not a sociological case study, as so many of us try to approach it. The work of forgiveness is a spiritual, miraculous work, and it has to come from above. It has to start with Christ in us, and it has to start with us understanding the true nature of sin, right? We can't understand true forgiveness if we don't understand the true nature of sin, which is what we call the corporate reality of sin. I'm gonna let somebody else talk and then I'll talk.
So what I'm hearing you say is, for us, in order for us to maintain peace, in order for us to maintain some semblance of peace, we as a people, as an African American people, need to come together and forgive each other.
Amen.
That's where it starts.
Amen.
Because if we don't forgive each other, then no anyone else that comes into the space, other brothers and sisters of a different nationality, different race, we're still messed up.
Yes, yes, yes. You see, let me jump in really quickly again. There are so many barriers that were set in place for us that contribute to the disconnection, the disparities, the I'm lost for a word, an adjective here, man. There's so many of them that were set in place. Let me start within that whole experience of the diaspora. If we were grouped together and we spoke the same tongue, they made sure to separate us, right? When you saw a family unit, mother ended up in Brazil, father ended up in my native Guyana, children ended up in Panama or Haiti or in America itself, and so on and so forth. The whole scattering, the whole splitting, the whole destroying of the unity of language, there was so much done to keep us separate. Now, when we listen, let me not get into nation building. Those of us who are not of a U.S. birth, those of us, I'm now speaking to my Caribbean, my South American, my Latin American Afro brothers and sisters. Growth has been much harder for us as a displaced body. Let me take my nation, for example. We have Africans, we have Portuguese, we have East Indians from South Asia, we have Pakistanis, we have Chinese, et cetera, et cetera. All those groups, when they were displaced through the same imperialistic methods that displaced us, but yet they came mostly as indentured servants and laborers and businessmen, they remain connected to their nation of origin, right? So they were able to get money and communication, spiritual nurture, and all that from their families in Pakistan, South India, China, Portugal, wherever. That pipeline was never broken, but for us, it was completely severed. So we as a people of color, even economically, we had nowhere to turn. There was no Bank of Africa that we could immediately connect to. There was no spiritual lineage, as a direct connection, right? Not even familial. So we're starting from scratch. And people of color need to understand that as we move forward towards this work of forgiveness. There's a lot that has been done to cause that playing field to be a level. But what do? People beat up on us and we beat up on each other. So now we have to accept labels like, well, you're a black person leading a third world country, and one president labeled it a S-hole country because we're economically deprived and we're struggling in poverty and all of this stuff. But people need to consider the obstacles that were placed and the disadvantages that we face even building what we have now. Same for our communities, right? So I'm gonna jump on the black on black crime thing as soon as I have a chance to speak on that. But within this forgiveness, thank you, Pastor Fraser, within this forgiveness, we have got to start by forgiving each other. We know African-American and Caribbean folk got tension, and then we both got tension with Africans because they basically sold us, not all of them, but some of them, and some of them are proud of it. Some of them haven't repented of that action. There are Africans who will not allow their child to marry an African American because, or a West Indian, because they basically see the product of the diaspora as a lesser. The fact that you became a slave means you came from a tribe that didn't have proper civil structure and values and all of that. You're a lesser person. All of this nonsense. So we have to get beyond all of that. We have to truly begin by forgiving each other. But we need to understand our corporate reality of sin.
Dr. Fraser, can I address your question real quick, please?
Yes.
I think we were talking about the idea of remaining nonviolent, also in how we get our message across. And a lot of people like to quote I don't know if it's to quote the text from MLK, Martin Luther King, to either support rioting and those things. But, a lot of people use the quote, rioting is the voice of the unheard. But I also would like to say another quote that Martin Luther King mentioned, and it's the limitations of riots moral questions aside, is that they cannot win, and participants know that. But in fact, what Martin Luther King is saying is riot is not revolutionary, it's actually reactionary. And what he means by that is because once you start a revolution that is reactionary, that you invite the inevitable outcome, which is defeat. And so that would say that the mindset of the people who believe in the revolutionary or the rioting, in fact, understand that they will lose. And so in that aspect, I think Martin Luther King is discouraging that fact, because he understands that even in trying to win a war and using riots, the desired outcome will not be achieved as one would think. And he also says that it involves an emotional catharsis, but it must be followed by a sense of futility. We got to understand that, you might damage some buildings. You might spray paint a couple of cars. You might put people in a position of fear, but it might not invoke the change that you want. And so I think that's why we should refrain from violence. But I have to mention just a brief caveat on what Pastor Lowe mentioned about addressing the societal ills which plague Black America, which is the violence that happened in our community. And I would suggest it's easy for us to say that the conflict happens amongst one another when segregation is still prevalent in the United States. A part where I live in Indiana, you can be in one area and just 2 miles up north, you are in a completely different environment, not heavily policed, not heavily drug infested, not heavily liquor stores on each and every corner, but it's a different oasis in which people who are of low income and African descent have not the privilege of partaking to. And so I would say that I would recommend, or I'd even suggest that the reason why there's criminal activity amongst people who live in low income areas is because that's what the design of it to be. It is to, it's almost as if someone gets a hemorrhaging on their body in order to stop, or an infection in their blood, in order to stop it from going on to the other parts of the body, it is sealed off from contamination of the blood. Well, I feel as if the African people have been sealed off from the rest of society in the sense of where we live, which would give a inaccurate picture of what really goes on in our community when they say Black. Well, if you put Black and you put a white person in the same community and you isolate them from communities that doesn't have symbolism of oppression and doesn't use tools of violence and policing to suppress another individual, then you would see Black on white crime. Matter of fact, if you do it to low income white, and it's drug infested and it's liquor infested, and there's no plan of action to try to fix these issues, then there would be white on white crime. So I just wanted to, objectively plug that into the conversation.
I see Brother Casey got a comment. I will follow after Brother Casey.
I'll say this. I'll quote Dr. King by saying, in terms of peace, we must develop and maintain the capacity to forgive. He who is devoid of the power to forgive is devoid of the power to love. There are some good in the worst of us and some evil in the best of us. When we discover this, we are less prone to hate our enemies. When we can understand, not agree with, but when we can understand, and I agree with Pastor Lowe, that's a heavily understanding. That's an understanding that has to come from your relationship with God. it requires us to not only be reflective of one another's thought processes, but of our own.
Yes.
Time is like, I mean, it's running out, but we're having a great conversation. But I want to touch on some other points here briefly before time just goes out the window. When we look at Black Lives Movement and we look at the march that took place in Washington, I mean, is there comparison? Do you see any comparison between the two? And what kind of comparisons? How would you compare them?
Well, I see there are commonalities, I would say, but certainly they're not the same. The commonality is they're both a group of people expressing their frustration relative to some particular predicament. Like we heard the quote earlier that Dr. King quote once again referenced that a riot is the voice of the unheard, so to speak. They have their issues for which they feel are not being heard, but one is demonstrated from the basis of the loss of their civil rights and their own oppression, while the other is demonstrating for if you ask me, greater privilege in essence, or restored privilege in essence. So there is a commonality, but I think we need to be careful that we not look at them as the same or even similar. That is between the movement of our nationalists or patriots or militias, whatever you want to call that group of people, and our own civil rights struggle.
I think in continuation of what Pastor Lowe is saying, I think it's very dangerous to try to put those two in the same bubble. What happened at the Capitol were not protests. Those people, as we are now finding out, had a plan to overthrow the government. These people came in thinking, and mind you, this is not, as I said before, something that just happened one day. This is a people who have been, forgive me for saying so, brainwashed with alternative facts, fake whatever, for a period of time, and decided to come to the Capitol to overthrow it. The Black Lives Matter movement, those who have been protesting, are fighting for the right to live, point blank, nothing else. All they want to do is be able to get up in the morning, put on their clothes and walk outside and expect not to die. These people, insurrectionists, they just want their way. It's almost like, for me, it's an adult temper tantrum. The Black Lives Matter movement is literally fighting for their lives. They say, listen, just don't shoot me. Hands up, don't shoot. Just don't shoot me. When you see me, just know I'm not a threat to you. If I've done something wrong, you have the right to arrest me, and you have the right to put me in jail, and you have the right to for me to have a trial and all of that. All I ask is that when I go through all these processes, I don't end up dead.
But don't you see the same commonality? They marched, Black Lives Movement, they marched, they were organized. And so the insurrectionists, as you call them, they marched, they were organized, and there was violence on both sides. So isn't there some kind of comparison between the two?
Yeah, I said commonality, yes. But as far as the two of them being similar or the same, no.
But both of these individuals feel that if they're fighting for the right to live.
Okay. Yes, and Pastor Gordon, I don't agree with you wholly, but I agree with you.
That's all right.
And this is the reason why. And I like that premise because I believe it should be implemented just to, incite fairness. And I understand your perspective, because if you look on the perspective of those who attacked Capitol Hill, they were fighting for a right to live. And I don't think it was necessarily about privilege. It was about privilege, but the bigger picture was the right to live. And this is the reason why. I believe it was the right to live because they felt as if, whether they were lied to or not, their truth and understanding that democracy was under attack, that the person that they felt deemed necessary to run their country was unfairly treated, and hence what happened, he lost the election. And so if they said, if that continues to happen, then what would say that everything that our Constitution upholds will be under attack next? So that's their idea of fighting for life. The thing where I find it problematic is the fact that the only evidence they have from that standpoint is not based upon fact, is based upon an individual who has been known to be a liar and a government that is known to be a liar as well. Hence the reason why we have inappropriate information being disseminated from our universities and from our schools about what really happened in Black history. And so if you allow and Martin Luther says a lie cannot live. And so if we allow that to happen, then we will never find a peaceful solution to this issue, because it would be based upon a lie. And to address what you were saying before, yes, they did have commonalities of fighting for a life to live, but their life to live is not the same spectrum as our life to live as African American. The Black Lives Matter movement the foundation is exactly in the name. Black lives should matter. And the fact that you should single it out to Black lives is where the problem lies. All lives should matter is the fact. And the reason why we have to protest for Black lives to matter is because we're not experiencing Black lives mattering. And so if that is the fact, then what happens is you protest for someone to pay attention to the demise of a culture and to your culture in which you reside, or which is a part of you. So no, it wasn't the same, but it was commonalities, what my brother said, and there are similarities, but the scope of being alive and the scope of a misconstrued definition of being alive, of having privilege, prosperity, and control. And when you don't have the control, then you kind of want to incite a revolution in that spectrum, which I don't believe that the matters were similar.
Okay. Pastoral, go ahead. Go ahead,
yeah, I want to jump into the matter of, I think we're closing out soon. And I didn't want to do so without touching on the healing process.
Yeah, I'm coming.
Another great quote from Dr. King. We must live together as brothers, or we'll perish together as fools. Now, we could look at that as it pertains to the Black community. You say, well, we people of color need to live together as brothers, but there is a macro perspective to that quote also, and that is the brotherhood of Christ, the brotherhood of his creation. That is all men, right? So all men need to get along as brothers, or all men will live together as fools. We need to look back at how the sin problem started. Right? We've got to start there. Often we start with the offense, right? And so we can easily start with slavery. We can easily start with the Dutch East India Trade. We could easily start with Jim Crow instead of Reconstruction, et cetera, et cetera. But we must start with the sin problem. And the sin problem began in Eden. And were it not for that sin problem, right? Were it not for that sin problem, we wouldn't have the struggle that we're dealing with today. Now, the truth and reality of that is also based on the book of Romans chapter 5, that sin problem affected all men, right? All men fell short. So we're not trying to wage an argument or rebuttal in that sense that one side is solely good and one side is solely evil. But the evil that we may find in the other side exists in us in potential also. Sin is sin. Sin is sin. I know we all got categories and degrees and all of that and so forth and different measures of sin, but sin is sin. And we all have sin flowing through our blood, right? So the sin that the other man may commit that would offend us, as we hold them accountable for that act, let us remember that the same degree and potential of sin exists in us. It's just that we haven't acted it out yet. So that is the corporate reality of sin. And with that, we go to the cross because we understand that Christ forgave the entire world at the cross. He pardoned the entire world at the cross. But the benefits of that pardon can only be experienced through the full process of forgiveness, wherein you receive the pardon and you give it back. Now, many of us in this world, we just want to take the pardon and run, right? So when we learned that we were forgiven at the cross, we were pardoned at the cross, we're like, thank you, God, and we're gone. But we fail to understand, as we're clearly told in Matthew chapter 6, if you only take the pardon and run with it, and you don't allow the pardon to reciprocate, you basically abort the full process of forgiveness. That's why he says, as you forgive those who offend you, as you forgive your debtors, et cetera, et cetera. It's a process that we must allow to be complete in and through us. We need to forgive those who have offended us also, as we have been forgiven, because true forgiveness is a process.
Can I interject for a moment, please, with what you said, Pastor Lowe? And I think we're all as spiritual leaders, whether you are a Black individual going through oppression or whether you feel as if it's unfair, I think we all can agree upon the stance you have taken when we understand that it is a sin problem and that we can't, look at individuals without looking at that aspect. And it brings me to Matthew 8:33. And when Jesus rebuked Peter and he said, I rebuke you, Satan. Now he called Peter Satan. And that's an interesting text, because I think what you're saying is understanding that Satan is actively involved in what we see in human beings. He incites people. But not by, you have to choose to allow him to come inside and to incite you. We all aware of that. But what I wanted to shed light on is that Jesus did not ignore the fact that Peter was still a conduit, but he allowed us to see that he was a controlled vessel by Lucifer. So he didn't call him Peter, but even though he realized it was still Peter's responsibility to not allow the enemy to come inside of him. And I think the reason why he came inside of Peter is exactly what was outlined in the chapter, is where Jesus referenced that you're looking for the will of man instead of the will of God. And I think in order for us to move into that process of what you mentioned, Pastor Lowe, about not just understanding it as a sin problem, but Jesus did not become silent. He did not become passive in whom he was dealing with. And he did address him as such. And I think that's what we need to go into, the aspect of addressing the entity that plagues this type of response to individuals. And I think if we become silent or we become unlikely to stand to the world, then that's where we as faith leaders take a hemorrhaging into what we're doing as to bring the gospel to all the world. And what I mean by saying that is, Bonhoeffer eloquently stated, once the church stops existing for the community, the church stops existing. And I think that's where we're coming now with the moral decline of America and the silence of the churches as a whole. We have become unimpressed with trying to implement change into communities, and we become silent to those world affairs.
in Martin Luther King's book, Why We Can't Wait, he stated the church, and at that time, was silent. You alluded to that. How does faith play a role in all that is taking place today through civil responsibility? How can we, as people of faith, what can we do? Is it a march? Is it a prayer vigil? What are some of the practical things that we can do instead of being silent?
We have a responsibility as clerics, especially, to speak out against those things that are wrong in our society. We have a responsibility to foster a culture of forgiveness, but not forgetness. For forgetfulness. We have to, because if we do forget, we are doomed to repeat our past. And so while we are learning and teaching to our congregants to love, while we are teaching them to forgive, we also have to be active participants within the community construct. We have to be active in meetings, in marches, in teaching, in as we do at our church, meeting the needs of the people as Jesus did. Jesus, in protest, did good. The church is doing nothing. And and here's the problem: when we are silent, when we do nothing, we become complicit in the lack of progress of the people that we are meant to help. And so we have to be more vocal, more present. And the biggest part is the church has to be more relevant, more current. We can't be so heavenly minded that we're no earthly good, because we're telling everybody you need to prepare and be good for heaven. And you, as it is, we're not good citizens on earth, much less good citizens for heaven. And so we have to develop people who are not only on their path to making it to the kingdom, but on their path to make an impact in this world, so that while we are here, we can save others, even through what we're doing in our community and dealing with the civil unrest.
So as people of faith, we have a role. Pastor Lowe, you were jumping.
Absolutely, we have a role. Let me start with another Dr. King quote here. In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. Goes on to say, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. I want to close with dismissing the misconception that there is something wrong in the Christian having a voice. There's something wrong in the Seventh-day Adventist having a voice, in the Presbyterian or the Catholic having a voice. There's something wrong with Christians having a voice. This is a misconception. Christ himself, we see in his ministry, we see Christ being very vocal. We see James defining true religion or pure religion as a form of activism itself. I want to read a quick quote from this institution's early beginnings, 1865. This is right post the Civil War. And it says, on the matter of voting, resolved that in our judgment, the act of voting, when exercised in behalf of justice, humanity, and right, is in itself blameless and may be at some times highly proper, but that the casting of any vote that shall strengthen the cause of such crimes as intemperance, insurrection, and slavery, we regard as highly criminal in the sight of heaven. But we would depreciate any participation in the spirit of party strife. From the review, May 23rd, 1865. So we can see even in the foundation, in the embryo of this church, we had values of activism. It is a myth, it is a misconception that Christians, especially Protestant Christians, should be silent within the matter of protest or speaking up and against the inhumanities that we face in society. But again, as we do so, let us remember our corporate reality of sin.
Can I just, I know we're closing, but I wanted to give a statement on based upon what you said. And one of the things I realized about what's going on, and it's sectarian ecclesiology, and it's basically just a form of being silent and not, and what they believe is that being silent prevents them to conforming to the world. And I want to rebuke that notion, because in fact, what happens is when we do that, we tell the world that we view them as a certain category of people that are not redeemable. So what happens is it doesn't invoke people to come to an understanding of the gospel and to be charged with the excitement of coming into being in a right relationship with Jesus Christ, but it also thinks that our God, our Jesus, is unattainable because he's not concerned of human affairs. And what happens is we become not the hands and feet of Jesus, but we just become the hands and feet of ourselves. And if we do that in self, and we all know a reading of Paul, one of the great theologians and one of the great authors in the Pauline epistles, mentioned that I die daily. And the reason why I die daily is not that I live, but Christ lives in me. And if Christ is living in you, then you will take an active role in the concerns of righting the travesties that occur in our society.
As you said, Christ living in you, you would take an active role. But if I am to search scriptures, or we're to search scriptures, when Christ was actually living on this earth, what role did he take in the political culture of his day? Did he take a role? Or he had a mission, and that mission was to preach the kingdom of heaven at hand, and he stuck with his mission?
That's a great question. I'm glad you asked it the way you asked it, man. You not to bump you up, but that questioning was really good. But I want to stay focused in my answer, and my answer is it's based upon just his act in the marriage feast at Cana. It wasn't his mission to turn water into wine. Matter of fact, he even told his mother, don't trouble me with these issues. It's not my time as of yet. But however, he did not ignore the responsibility of having the power to act, but yet did nothing. There was an issue with them running out of wine for the wedding. He addressed the issue, even though it wasn't his mission. You see many stories of this when healing. It wasn't his mission, but what did we hear in the text with him being becoming insightful in compassion about the sufferings of the people? What about the mission before he got on the boat? He said that he was incited by the people because he looked upon them as sheep without a shepherd. Even though it might not necessarily be his mission, he doesn't ever try to not address the responsibility of the power to act. And so I think that's what we should take from the lessons of Christ. Even in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, it wasn't his mission to go against Roman authority, but yet he did not ignore the responsibility to prepare a people to be able to live and survive the insurrection that was going to happen within the Roman government. And yet it prepared them for what's to come, because we got to understand that when Jesus doesn't necessarily act on a certain mission, or he doesn't deviate from his mission, he also doesn't ignore responsibility when it's called for him to act.
Pastor, you wanted to.
Yeah, man, if I can just quote quickly,
Wisdom there.
I'm going to let Jesus say it himself. I'm going to let him say it himself, Luke 4:18, right? This is his mission according to him, right? It says, he hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor.
Mm-hmm.
He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted,
Mm-hmm.
to preach deliverance to the captives. Well, you need to do some exegesis on that, what deliverance to captives mean, and recovering of sight to the blind. I'll just preach this text and we'll be here till tomorrow, but I would just let Jesus say that.
Thank you. So Jesus did play an active role in his day, and I think we ought to be playing an active role. Vote. I mean, be active.
Be involved in good trouble. Good trouble.
I like that. Good trouble. Good trouble. Yeah. As we wrap this up, I want to, ask this final question. What are some of the ways, that we can keep Dr. King's dream alive today? Does it seem as if the dream is dying? What can we do? Give some practical things that we can do to keep his dream alive.
We can be relevant. We can be vocal. We can be passionate. And I think most of all, we need to be aware of where we are in time, aware of where we've been, and aware of where we're trying to go. Creating a plan of action and acting on that plan. And I think those are practical things. It sounds easy. It really actually takes us taking time to sit down and doing some self-examination, doing some community self-examination, not just where I want to be, where do I want my family, my extended family, my community, my people, our nation, where do we want to be? And I think all of those things tie into your focus.
Thank you. Pastor Mason.
Yes, I wanted to say, I think the best best practical way in just finding a start is essentially dealing with the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is there is a system that has been instituted by men that have been infiltrated by the deceiver himself to continue to stigmatize, to marginalize a group of people. And if we don't address that elephant in the room that says that there is a system that is broken and that the system needs to be revamped, or even, dare I say, restarted to where it doesn't isolate a group of people from the pursuit of the dream in which we mentioned. And one of the things that I believe that happened to Martin Luther King's dream, which one would say, well, in order for a dream to become a goal, there's steps that need to take place. And I think what happened was before Martin Luther King life was cut short, he had a dream and he was working on a process on how we can turn that into a goal, into a fulfilling a goal. So I believe that we have to accept the ideal that Martin Luther King's dream is a dream rooted upon the basis that people will participate, i.e. will say a vision. And what that vision looks like, because we all know what the scripture says about a vision, without a vision, the people will perish. But when we transition from the dream to a goal to incorporating the vision and what that looks like, it comes with a restarting and a revamping of an oppressive institution an oppressive system that has affected every level of our society, not only in the government, not only in education, not only media, but also in the church spectrum as well. And in order for us to make changes in those sectors, it takes for individuals, I would say, impressed by the unction of the Holy Spirit to go forward. Because what we understand by Dr. King, it was a spiritual movement. Because in order for him to make impact, being the less than, the inferior, he needed a supernatural answer for a natural problem.
Thank you, Pastor Lowe.
If I would say Dr. King did his best to uphold the model and the example of Jesus Christ. There is much that I appreciate in the struggle of Malcolm X. There's even much I appreciate in the struggle of Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam and many others, Marcus Garvey and many others. But the contrasting difference is this. Dr. King took an approach that was nonviolent, so we need to continue to model that, because so did Christ. But I think the variable that we miss is that Christ always ministered from a perspective of others, not so much from a perspective of self. So he was more others focused than he was self focused. Now, how do we deal with our own challenges and our needs without focusing on ourselves? We can't. We have to look within also, right? So yes, it starts with dealing with whatever issues and obstacles we are facing. But while we do so, let us not neglect the need to advocate and be strong activists and voices of emancipation for others, for all people who are downtrodden. And this is why Dr. King was revered and appreciated globally, because he truly took that commitment towards the emancipation of all oppressed people. That's what Christ modeled. That's what he tried to model. That's what we should also.
Thank you so much for that. I believe that one of the big things that I take away from Dr. King is his speech where he talks about that one day when all God's children, Black, white, Jews, Gentiles, Protestants, Catholics, will be able to join hands together and sing an old Negro spiritual song, Free at Last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we're free at last.
Sir.
That, I believe, in keeping his dream alive, we've got to get to a place where we can unify, where we can join hands together. We can look at each other not as Black, whites, Jews, Gentiles, Protestants, Seventh-day Adventists. We can look at each other as God's children. And when that happens, I believe that his dream will be realized. I just want to thank all of our panelists for their participation today in this discussion. We've had a great discussion as we look at revisiting the dream of Dr. Martin Luther King. And I want to thank you, Pastor Lowe, for your time. Thank you, Pastor Mays, Dr. Casey. Thank you all for your time. Without you, this discussion, this conversation would not have been so interesting. And it was indeed, I sure had a great time just with you all. And I also want to let you know that the Road to Eternity Ministry is putting this on. And I want to thank them for their vision. And I want to thank them for the time that they will spend. Now there's a DVD, there's I think it's a video, yes, from Road to Eternity that is called Liberating a Nation. I saw it, and it's a powerful DVD, and it will air right after this discussion. Thank you, gentlemen. God bless you, and God bless America and all of us.
And now, here is a special sneak preview of Road to Eternity's King Liberating the Nation.
minister, activist, leader. These are just a few titles given to a man who is recognized today as one of the most remarkable people in American history. Join us as we celebrate the legacy of Dr. King, from his early days as a young child in Atlanta, Georgia, to the creation of a campaign for people in poverty following the days of his death. This is King, liberating a nation. Welcome to the DuSable Museum of African American History, where history, culture, and art come to life. It's appropriate that we find ourselves here in this building, where each relic holds a chronicle from the past to unveil. Because right now, we're going to travel back in time to witness the story of Dr. King and the incredible journey he embarked on in order to become one of the most remarkable leaders of the 20th century. But first, let's take a look at something more familiar.
When we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Because of this motivating speech, individuals were prompted to take action against economic inequality and racial discrimination in the workplace, so that all Americans can live together in peace throughout the country. As a result of the march, the United States Congress enacted the Civil Rights Act of 1964 on July 2nd, which prohibited racial segregation and discrimination in schools and public facilities.
I would simply like to say that I think this has been one of the great days of America. And I think this march will go down as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, demonstrations for freedom and human dignity ever held in the United States.
On October 14th, Dr. King was given the Nobel Peace Prize for applying his strategies of nonviolence in the United States, and was the youngest recipient of the award at that time.